You may decide to use an introduction in your podcast, or you may not. It just depends on the type of podcast that you have. For me, I generally don't use an introduction. However, for your podcast, it may be beneficial.
So your podcast's introduction is everything the listener hears when they press play, all the way to when they actually start sharing your podcast. The introduction is simply sort of a sound or a communication of some sort that is consistent on every episode of your podcast. And so it's sort of something that people can rely on and listen for when they engage your podcast. It's just sort of, I like to call it a jingle. It's a jingle that comes on every single time. It's also similar to if you watch a TV show always has an introduction where they introduce the title, the name, and all sorts. So let's dive into the 11 potential things that you could possibly use for your podcast introduction or opener. So you can use your podcast name. How else will people know what your podcast is about? Or you can use an episode number. And actually, you should include your episode number in your podcast intro. It gives chronology and easy redirecting to show notes if you make show notes easy to get to. You can also use episode title, which I would also say that you should also include this on every one of your podcasts. If your title explains the content of your episode, which I recommend, unless you're doing some kind of comedy, then include it in your recording. Music or sound effects. Use something that other podcasters aren't using, and this helps your brand or your show. And the whole goal of it is that it's just a sort of like a signature that people hear and immediately know that it's your podcast. You could also use your host names, which I would suggest you do all times. Just say, hey, this is Vaughn with Podcast with Coaches. And it just helps your listeners know who you are. And I definitely suggest introducing yourself. A podcast tagline or explanation. Don't assume every listener knows what your podcast is all about, because you are using this podcast not only for your current clients and members and audience, but also to communicate and attract new prospective clients and audience members. Explain the purpose of the podcast or its tagline, which should be shortened, a shortened version of your purpose. Summary. Tell your audience what you're going to talk about. You could also communicate your network ID. If you are a member of a network, you're probably required to state this in some way, form or fashion. You could also state your recorded date. I suggest mentioning the recorded date only if your content is time sensitive or current event related, like a news podcast. Also, if you have sponsors, the people who help you pay the bills, or your own products or services, you want to also communicate that as well. If your content is for a mature audience, you want to put a disclaimer as early as possible. Okay, so within the app, let's go over creating an introduction. Let's go into an episode that we already have, and we can actually edit that episode. But when we create an episode, you see we have segments, and these segments, we can reference back to them indefinitely. So in the future, we can use one segment or the other segment and include it in our new episode. So let's look at how we're going to do that. Let's say that we wanted to edit this particular episode and add another segment to it. Well, here's what we did. We simply clicked on the app, and then we clicked on your podcast. We clicked on your podcast, and then it brought us here. And then we click on the episode itself, and then it brings us to this screen. And then here we can just scroll down and you'll see segments, and then we can choose to add other elements to the segments. So once I click let me go back to it here so you see what I did. I clicked this plus sign here that is next to the pencil sign. So once I clicked on this plus sign, it brings me to this screen. So this screen here is where we can actually edit and add new segments, new details to our episode. And here's what happens. We can actually go back to our prior episodes and add new segments to it. And what will happen is that it will be updated on all the platforms. So for instance, I can move this around. I can move this here. And then if I want to save this and update it throughout the podcast ecosystem, I can just click save, but I'm not going to do that. Let me put it back the way it was. So, but if we wanted to add a new segment or something that we want to always put into our podcast, we can simply do that. We can simply either record something that we can always reference or add something from elsewhere. But right now, this is the only episode that we have. So what we're going to do is add a new introduction. This is Podcast for Coaches by Vaughn. Have fun and let's learn a lot today. This is Podcast for Coaches.
Let's test it.
By Vaughn. Have fun and let's learn a lot today. I think it's all right. Let's add a background music to it though. I'm going to add this one here. And then I'm going to save it. Podcast introduction. This will be the title. Add recording to episode. And then we can always go to library to see all of the segments that we've created. So you see, podcast introduction and all the other segments that we created in creating our episode. And if we want to use it, we can just, click on the plus sign to add it to our current episode. We can also import audio from other places. So from our phone's hard drive or even from our computer. That's also possible as well. Additionally, the menus that we have here on the bottom allows us to add various things. So for instance, interludes. Interludes are something that helps you to separate one segment from the next. And I do like using these because they help to kind of partition the podcast. So let's add a couple here that we're going to use to separate the 3 segments that we have. And you'll see how it works. So the interludes are the separation. And then we can also go into sounds. The sounds are just little sounds that you can add to your podcast if you choose to. And then also there are songs that you can add. However, you have to connect your application to an Apple Music or Spotify Premium, which is not really so necessary. So I don't usually do it. I don't want to connect this application to my Apple Music or Spotify Premium. And additionally, my podcast and this podcast isn't really about music. If it was, it may be beneficial to do that. However, that's not the case here. So let's go back to our podcast and let's see what we have. I just click X. So the Elmore Heights, this was the interlude that we can add between our segments. And I forgot the actual podcast introduction that we had created. So let's go back and get it. So I'll click on this big plus sign here. And then I'll go to the library and the podcast introduction. Where is it? This one here. So this was it. I'm going to add that. I'm going to add it to the episode. And I want to add another interlude. I think I'll add actually 3 interludes total. And then I'm going to X out of here. And then here are the 2 interludes and the podcast introduction that we created earlier. And so I'm just going to move this podcast introduction up to the top, just as I've done here. And then I'm going to move the interlude up a bit to separate the 2 segments up top. I'm going to move this other interlude in between. And then I'm going to move this interlude right here. I have an extra podcast introduction. Let me go ahead and delete that because we don't need it. I'm going to remove this extra introduction. Okay, we're good there. And then just to confirm, we have the introduction, the middle segment, and then the summary segment. And so we've just created an introduction and structured our podcast in a way that offers interludes to separate the segments and also includes an introduction.